This episode of the Modern Therapist Survival Guide is brought to you by Lisa Marie Counting.
Numbers, finances, budgeting. Do you cringe just thinking about your business numbers? Are they your absolute nemesis? If you don't know what's coming in or what's going out, or what's available for marketing or what's owed for taxes, chaos ensues. Panic, fear, and even shame take over.
At Lisa Marie Accounting, she knows that an owner who understands her finances takes control over her business and her destiny. Lisa's job is to help you get your numbers feeling sassy, sexy, and a whole lot badassy. Because when you know and love your numbers, everything you do is informed, calculated, and creates unbridled success.
Listen at the end of the episode for more from Lisa Marie Accounting.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapist. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, and occasionally we jump into some of the cultural and racial issues that are going on in the world, how to be knowledgeable of working with different cultures, working towards a cultural humility in understanding people from a number of different backgrounds. And if you've somehow managed to avoid anything in the news over the last week, there seems to be a culture that we've been meaning to talk about for quite a while. It seemed really relevant to bring up now just because it does seem to be so pertinent. It seems to be affecting a lot of not only clients who are coming to us, but also a lot of people in the therapist community. And this is the Iranian Persian community, and we are bringing on a couple of people to help us navigate this conversation. First, we have Pardis Mahdavi. She is the professor and director of the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. And we're also joined by Negeen Moussavian. She's an associate marriage and family therapist here in the Los Angeles area. And thank you both for joining us today and lending your knowledge and expertise to us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
So, Pardis, we went to college together, so I'm so pleased that we were able to reconnect and have this conversation together. One thing that we ask all of our guests is, who are you and what are you putting out in the world?
It's a big question, but a great question to start with, Katie. And it's really wonderful to reconnect with you and think about all that's transpired in the 2 decades plus.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Since college. So as you all mentioned, I'm a professor. My PhD is actually in medical anthropology because I wanted to study sexuality, sexual politics specifically. You know, after I graduated from Occidental studying diplomacy and world affairs, I went to Columbia to continue studying international affairs, but fell in love with anthropology, mostly because of the method. I was really moved by the approach of anthropology to live with communities and learn from, and kind of a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach. At the same time, I started traveling back to Iran for the first time. So I'm a child of the revolution. My parents came in the years just preceding the revolution. So I was actually born in the United States, but I never visited Iran until I was 20 years old. So I began traveling back to Iran in the 90s. But growing up, I felt a sense of liminality, not belonging neither here nor there, existing betwixt and between cultures all my life. So I never felt like I belonged in America. I felt like I was too Iranian in America. And then when I started traveling to Iran, initially I went to Iran because I thought, well, maybe I fit in there. But then I realized I'm too American in Iran. And so I was really interested to start, learning from, researching with initially women's movement activists, feminist activists in Iran. So I initially started going to Iran when I was still an undergrad at Oxy, and I was writing stories for the Los Angeles Times Magazine. And I went to cover the women's movement. But when I arrived in Iran, the thing that was on everybody's minds and mouths was what young people call a sexual revolution, or engelab-jansi in Persian. And I was fascinated by the way in which young people who were dissatisfied with the regime were seeking to attack the regime by using their bodies to speak back, by comporting their resistance, if you will. And I think it bears mentioning that Iran has one of the youngest demographics in the world. 70% of Iran's population is under the age of 35, which is pretty significant. So this large youth population born after the revolution, many born during the Iran-Iraq War, they had a really different take on the regime, and many were disaffected by the regime. And so, they were very active in articulating their concerns with the regime. So I was fascinated by this movement, and I started researching, Iran's sexual revolution, and decided to stay for my PhD in anthropology and medical anthropology at Columbia. And that became my dissertation and the topic of my first book, Passionate Uprisings, Iran's Sexual Revolution. From there, I've continued to follow feminist activism, women's rights movements, sexuality, and human rights movements in the Middle East. So while my first book was on Iran, my subsequent 3 books have been on the Gulf, focusing really on the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and looking at questions around sex work, human trafficking, labor migration.
And we're also joined by Negeen Moussavian. She's one of our modern therapist staff. She's been with us here for the last couple of years, and she was actually one of my students at Pepperdine University. So you want to fill people in a little bit more about you? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep gushing about all of the wonderful work that you've been doing with us.
Yes, I do work in Curt's private practice, and I specialize with millennials, specifically dating, but also Iranian Americans. And my point is kind of to reach Iranian Americans from point of trauma and dealing with that time of the revolution. And when, coming from different families where some did come during the revolution, and having that dual, like not feeling like you belong, and, coming from that point, I think it's a really important aspect to touch on. I think it goes unseen a lot of times. So yeah, I have a really strong passion to bring my culture into my practice too.
So it's not a simple sort of part of the world, especially for those of us who are maybe just passively listening to headlines in the news. That the way that stories about the Middle East and especially Iran in general seem to be really politicized in ways that, as Pardis was talking about, I love this term liminality, and just kind of wanting to say, just there's a lot of opinions out there. How do we listen on this? Like, what's the way that we go about this to be informed in ways that are supportive of Iranian Americans, or for our listeners all over the world, people who may be coming from the Iranian community?
Well, I mean, first, I think it's important to be informed, right? I think that this is a time of heightened uncertainty on all sides. I talk to my family and friends in Iran, and they're frightened. They're truly afraid because there's so much uncertainty. And on this side, everybody's afraid, worried what's going to happen next, right? But in times of uncertainty, fear can quickly turn to hate. And I think as an Iranian American, that's something that I worry about, because when people don't understand something, are not informed by something, and when uncertainty is, really clouding our vision, very quickly people can start to take that fear and make it hate. And so one of the concerns many of us have as Iranian Americans right now is we fear this crushing, tsunami-like wave of Islamophobia that threatens to wash across this country right now. And that's been building really throughout, this president's term, really since 2016. But right now it's gaining some powerful and frightening momentum.
And if there's anything that I know about American history, it's that we will turn around and just totally embrace minorities like as soon as this is all up.
It's
going to be great. We're all going to be hugging.
This is a super justified fear. I mean, we saw this after 9/11. We saw this during the 80s with the Iran-Contra crisis,
right.
The Japanese internment camps during World War II, the ever-present ongoing native. This is a totally justified fear.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. You mentioned the Iran Contra actually, Curt, because that's something that hugely impacted my childhood. So as I mentioned, I was born here. I was born actually in Minnesota. I was born in Minnesota, in the late 70s. I don't want to exactly date myself. But, by the early 80s, Iran Contra was happening and the Iran hostage crisis was happening. And one day I came home from school and there was a sign. This is in Minneapolis. There was a sign posted in front of my door and it said, "Burn this house, terrorists."
Oh, wow.
And, my father decided then and there that it was time for us to pick up and move to Southern California. And it was interesting as we were moving, I was thinking a lot about my parents because, they had lost everything in Iran and come to the United States, and we were in Minnesota. And then here we lost everything again. Back to your earlier question, Katie, one of the things I remember my father saying to me, I was, very young. I was an elementary school kid at the time as we were moving to California. And he said to me, people can take everything from you. They can take your home, they can take your belongings, they can even take your country. But the one thing they can never take from you is your education. They can never take your mind. And that was one of the things that really instilled in me the value of higher education. So, right now I'm a scholar, but I'm also an administrator. And the reason I've gone into higher education administration is to help others get what can never be taken from them.
That's so powerful. Wow. To me, just to kind of take a step back a little bit, because I think there are a lot of us who aren't as knowledgeable and a lot of our listeners that may have no knowledge at all about the history of Iran and how it's intersected with the history of the United States. Can you give us a little bit of a primer?
How long do you have? Remember, I'm still a professor. No, I guess for the purposes of what we're talking about today, and the moment that the United States and Iran find themselves in, I think it's useful to think about a few particular moments in time, maybe starting with 1953.
Okay.
Right. So 1953 was the CIA-backed coup that overthrew Mossadegh, who was Iran's democratically elected leader. And within 4 days, the CIA initiated a coup that removed him in 1953. So thus began this very, rocky and tense relationship. During the period of the Shah's reign, U.S.-Iran relations were warming to a point where actually some people felt concerned because there was this distrust from 1953. And so the regime that is in power today, that came to power in the 70s, they actually came to power on a platform of resisting Westoxication, which is that infatuation with the West. The Persian word there is Gharbzadegi, which is interesting. That the Islamists came to power saying, we've lost our way, we've lost our morality, we've become overly intoxicated with the West, and so Khomeini came to power on this platform of restoring a moral order and restoring an Iranianness from the Shah, who had made at the time Iran overly westernized, I suppose. So you have that. So you've got 1953, and then you've got 1979, which is the revolution where Khomeini comes to power and ousts the Shah, and things really reverse very, very quickly. So I look a lot at culture, and I look a lot at youth cultures and subcultures, and how people embody and comport their politics. So, visually, if you think about it, you go from looking at women in miniskirts with, very extensive hairdos to women in hijab, right? Almost overnight, right?
Yeah.
And I think women's bodies are a really interesting site to analyze the history of Iran. It's kind of what I do in my work. But so then you have 1979, which happens. And then, so, in 1979, the revolution had happened. And then in the 1980s, Iran goes into the Iran-Iraq war. Now, due to the revolution and the war, Khomeini and his team enacted pro-natalist policies where they encouraged families to have as many children as possible. And the way that they did this was that any family that had more than 2 or 3 kids got a tax break, and any family that had 5 kids or more got a free plot of land. Wow. So this is how we get to this demographic bulge that sort of resembles a snake swallowing a rabbit, if you will. So you had these pro-natalist policies in the 80s, and families were encouraged to have a lot of children. by the 90s, they realized that the birth rate had shot up, right? And that they were not going to be able to support this huge population. And so the regime did a 180 and they put family planning policies in place. And so they said, if you have more than 2 kids, you're going to get taxed. And they had all this mandatory family planning education and programming for all couples wanting to get married. So the fertility rate for women went from 4.5 to 1.7 in a span of like 2 or 3 years, which earned Iran the award for family planning from the United Nations Fund for UNFPA, which is kind of people don't know about that. Iran got the family planning award. Who would have thought? But so what ended up happening then is you have a huge number of people who were born basically between 1979 and 1995, right? You've got this huge demographic bulge, highly educated, among the most educated populations in the region, if not the continent. 60% of university graduates are women, so highly educated. And the more they became educated and the older they got, the more disaffected they became with the regime. So then, you have Khomeini's death, and then another key turning point, I think, was the election of Khatami, right? And so then you have this period in the late 90s and early 2000s of, moderation, kind of an opening up, people call it, an opening up for Iran. But, young people were still gaining power and momentum and strength. And then you had the election of President Ahmadinejad. And that's when, again, you start to see rising tensions between the United States and Iran. And also an increase in the youth movement. So I kind of documented the sexual revolution between 2000, 2006, 2007. So my book came out in 2008. And at the end of the book, I argued, I think this is going to lead to a civil rights type movement. And in 2009, sure enough, we had the Green Movement, which you're all familiar with, where, young people in the streets protesting the re-election of Ahmadinejad. And, it's interesting. Many of us who study Iran right now have wondered if that wasn't a missed opportunity for Washington, right? You had a large number of people in the streets protesting, trying to unseat the hardliners. And the question being, where was the support then? If people were really committed to regime change, where was the support of that local organic movement, which would have probably changed the regime, without having to cause what we're calling World War III right now.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, 2009, I think, is a particular turning point. And then you had a series of feminist movements. The 1 Million Signatures campaign started in 2006, My Stealthy Freedom, which is 2013, 2014. And then the world has really been watching the just mass protests that have involved people from a variety of religious backgrounds and a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds pouring into the streets 2017, 2018, and then 2018, 2019 as well. But all of that right now has kind of been quashed because with the recent U.S. Aggression, suddenly the Iranian regime has a lot more power and a lot more weight to calling the United States the Great Satan.
Yeah.
And this is impacting Iranian Americans, and especially in ways. I know that you bring up, that the world has been watching, but I think in some of the ways that this has been limiting is, if it wasn't for Negeen, I wouldn't know about the internet shutoff, the ways that the financial impacts of Iranian Americans have kind of been happening over the last couple of decades here. And I think that this is really important in understanding what it is for clients and people who are seeking support at this time as well.
Yeah, and I think that I'm really glad that, Negeen, that you are working on this trauma because I know that when I was young and growing up, my parents always had one suitcase packed, ready to go back, right? And that feeling of, okay, well, this is temporary, and we'll be here in the United States for a little bit, and this was in the 70s and early 80s, and then we'll go back. And then this slow, very challenging and very emotional transition to saying maybe we can't go back, or what's going to happen to us, and how do we make a home here? How do we make a sense of belonging here in the United States when there is so much tension between our ancestral country and here?
What do you think the impacts are? Because I picture this suitcase packed, and that just was that was very visceral for me to think about that. The kind of this impermanence, a feeling of impermanence. I think that there's so many different ways that this shows up for both Pardis and Negeen. What do you think the impacts on what's happening in Iran, to Iran? Like, what do you think is, how do we get our heads around what this feels like so that we can empathize with our clients who are coming and seeking support?
I mean, I also think it's important to note that your clients will probably be having a wide range of emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are going to have different positions, and people are going to have different experiences. One of the things that's happened for me and my social media feeds is people really, as much disagreement as there is in Washington over what's going on, there's a lot of disagreement amongst Iranians and Iranian Americans, right? And then you have people who are feeling conflicted. So on the one hand, they're frustrated at, how could the United States initiate this? How is this happening? People are shocked. Why assassinate Soleimani? Why? And people are feeling fear and concern and sadness. They're on the one hand fearful, as I mentioned, fearful for our own experience here, this wave of Islamophobia that's coming. On the other hand, there's this feeling of, and I've heard some people on my feed saying, okay, but this could be bringing about the regime change,
yeah.
Right? And so there are people who feel conflicted, genuinely conflicted, and saying, well, on the other hand, it's interesting. In California, you have, and in Arizona too, actually, you have a pretty strong presence of Iranian American Republicans, and Negeen probably is familiar with these folks, and they've actually been quite supportive of President Trump because they feel that Trump will remove the regime. Now, I don't think anyone agrees with the methods, but they feel like, well, this is some pressure that's been needed for 40 years. So people are feeling conflicted. I think different people are experiencing different components of this. For me, the biggest weight is the sadness. Why is this happening? And it's just, for me, it's coalesced like 40 years of that liminality, of that crushing in-betweenness, of that crushing sense of not belonging. So for me, my big focus is, I'm sad, I'm concerned about the violence. I'm very sad, I'm very worried. And I'm also very worried about hate, breaking out. So I think your clients are probably going to be feeling a number of feelings all at once. Some people are going to be concerned about the destabilizing effect it has on the Middle East. So we've been talking a lot about Iranian American clients, but many of my Arab American friends are terrified right now, right? Many of my Iraqi American friends, many of my Lebanese American, my Syrian American friends, and folks in the region, and as I mentioned, I've done a lot of work in the Gulf. And my friends that I've been speaking with in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, and in Doha, they're also very concerned. So I think we also have to think about the region. So you might want to think about also your clients who are just, Muslim American as well. Because, I also have friends who are not Iranian, who are not Arab, who are South Asian and who are Muslim. And in fact, I remember on Thursday night, I had text from a number of my friends saying, do we now have a target on our backs? Right? So, I think it's important to think not only about your Iranian American clients, but how wide sweeping that fear and that sadness is right now.
For a lot of American therapists, we hear these kinds of fears from clients. We hear these kinds of, whether it's culturally related or not, we tend to try and help people take their feelings, making the personal political, going and doing something with these feelings. What is it that's unique about Iranian clients that may not afford them kind of the same opportunities that traditional white American clients might be facing?
Well, this is also going to be generation specific, right? So I think my parents' generation, our parents' generation of Iranians, they still carry the anxieties about speaking out, and that brought them here.
Yeah.
Right. So they're a little bit, they have that fear. I think my generation has been a lot more outspoken because we didn't live the revolution in the same way that our parents did. But I think my generation suddenly right now, like I said, fears, this Islamophobia. Like I said, do we have a target on our back now? the one thing that I think many of us have appreciated is the support and solidarity that has come from other ethnic and racial groups at this very challenging time. I know that the Black community and the Indigenous community, certainly here in Arizona, have been incredibly supportive. They were among the first folks to reach out to us saying, we know what it's like to have a target on your back. How can we support you? And so, I think many of us have deep gratitude for that as we're struggling with this fear right now that's settling in.
Yeah. And I feel like you said, different generations have different effects on, speaking out and advocating. So my parents, it's limited to what I can post and advocate for. So for them, the fear is, don't share too much about your opinions and it'll affect you going back to Iran. And so that affects how much I share too. And that's the whole generational, trauma coming in. During the revolution, we couldn't speak up that much about our opinions. So don't do it either. That fear of and I'm sure you can speak to that too, because, I'm sure that when I have kids, they're not going to need to worry about that. But, it's something that I'm dealing with, that both the opinions of the people that were born here, let's go protest. And for me, I'm dealing with both of those impacts.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's
difficult
for me, at least.
What has been your experience, Negeen? When you go back to Iran, and one thing that was really eye-opening for me was when I went to Iran and I saw all the people who are our age who were protesting. What was your experience when you saw that?
So for me, I haven't been back since 2014. But, you spoke about feeling like no sense of belonging here or there. For me, I felt way more American when I went there when I was younger in 2014. But now I feel way more Iranian, and I'm protesting or trying to through social media. But I've gotten a lot of backlash from it. Like you said, varying opinions. So I have people that are like, it's good that we're doing this and we're going to change the regime. But for me, I feel conflicted, and it's affecting my ability to advocate. And the protests in Iran, I feel like that's their way of having a voice. I think that they get punished a lot for having a voice, and it's different here. That's not going to happen here, the punishment that we get. But in terms of, I think people should advocate, but in different ways.
Yeah, I know. I was really moved by seeing people our age speaking up and speaking out, and willing to risk going to jail, willing to risk being lashed for speaking out. Because, like you, I had grown up with parents who said the same thing. Don't speak your opinions too loudly. I was thinking about the Hamilton, Aaron Burr, talk less, smile more kind of thing, right? And I kind of feel like Iranian Americans should get a shirt that says that. But then when I went to Iran and I saw that, no, our culture doesn't tell us to be quiet. Here's this whole generation of people who are showing such courage in speaking out. And that for me was incredibly inspiring in helping me find my feet and helping me find a sense of belonging in and through transnational feminist activism.
Because the Iranian people are different than the Iranian government.
and because the Iranians in Iran are different than the Iranian Americans, and so much more brave, right? In many ways. I mean, I think Iranian Americans are also incredibly brave, especially, as the generations go on. But the courage that young people in Iran have shown, especially if you think about the Green Movement, 2009, and My Stealthy Freedom, and these protests, they've shown tremendous courage. And I think one of the things that has happened in this last week is when, Americans consume media about Iran, the way Iran is consumed eclipses that. And it elides the huge amount of courage that so many activists have shown over these last couple of decades.
So I'm glad that you're bringing up this piece about the way now, especially because, when we first reached out to Pardis and Negeen about coming onto this was just a couple of days ago. This was the sky is falling. World War III is happening tomorrow. We had very naive questions of where are things going to be in 5 years that we kind of settled on. We don't even know where things are going to be in 5 minutes. And very much over the last couple of days, and even between recording this and our publishing date, I'm certain that things are going to be changing again. But the narratives that are coming out of the media, it cannot be easy to be an Iranian anywhere in the world and seeing this conflation between the way that the Iranian government is and Iranian people. And I'm hoping that you can speak to that experience a little bit here too.
Yeah. And I think actually this is where mental health professionals can really help us. One of the things that many of us are struggling with is in this time of uncertainty, as you said, things change every 5 minutes. How do we talk about it? How do we talk about it with our kids? I've been thinking a lot about the impact this is having on my children. So my daughter's 9 years old. And we were flying back Saturday from San Diego, which is where my parents live, to Phoenix. And we were in the airport and we were at the sort of magazine stand. And my kids saw the covers of all the newspapers and magazines that said, war with Iran. And, I just saw my daughter standing there at the news rack and her eyes were just growing really big. And, I started to see sort of tears forming in her eyes. And she said, is this really happening? And I said, yeah, it's definitely happening. And she said, but Mom, if the US and Iran are such enemies and they're so much at war, what does that mean for those of us who are US and Iran in one body? And for me, I felt that she had put words to something I'd been struggling with for 40 years. What is it to live, with two, in a sense, opposing cultures in one body, and how do you think about that? And how do we talk to the children about it?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I remember seeing, the protests and the videos because I've never, I didn't see all of that before. And I remember telling my dad, being very fearful of what's going to happen. And he kind of reassured me. He's like, things change because we've witnessed that 5 minutes, 5 days. And so it's difficult. I agree with your daughter. I mean, on one hand, you're kind of empathizing with the Iranians in Iran. And on the other hand, I'm American too. So it's like this back and forth of it's confusion. It's where do I belong? Am I for them or for here? And it's difficult. But I mean, it's for me, I try to gravitate towards what's right. And, I think that in terms of Iranians, they're advocating for freedom and the right to voice what they want. And I think that's where a lot of my back and forth goes of where do I even stand on this? It's confused. Even when I talk about it, I'm confused.
Yeah. And there's this question of, well, where do we go? What happens next? I mean, I remember in 2016, when Trump was elected and the Muslim ban happened. And I remember that, actually my daughter came home from school and she said that someone in her class at the time, I think she was a first grader, and someone in her class had said, now that Trump's elected, you're going to have to go home. And, I remember her coming home and to me and saying, I don't understand what that means. Where are we supposed to go? We don't fit in Iran and they're telling us we don't fit here. So, Trump saying, send them home. Where are we supposed to go?
Yeah. Go back to your country. I mean, you feel
where is my country? And also, what happened to my country?
And this is the part that I'm really hearing is that for especially a lot of Caucasian Americans that, may be fascinated with genealogy that can trace their roots back, several hundred years to relatively stable countries. It's easy to point to, my ancestors came over from England in the 1600s and, it's more or less the same place. Whereas even from one generation to the next of what you're talking about, that it's the same place, but it's not the same internal place that is really missing. And there's really that search for identity there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When my mom came with me in the late 90s, early 2000s, and she was born and raised in Tehran. And we got there and all the street names had been changed. And I just remember she was trying to find her house that she grew up in. And she just stood in the middle of a series of streets and she was crying because she was just trying to figure out how to get back to the home that she was born into because everything had changed.
And I think it's important to understand that the revolution also impacted the opinions of a lot of Iranians that came here in terms of generationally. Like, I have a lot of friends actually that do not identify as Iranians, and they get angry for, when they hear me like, advocate and, say like, this is wrong. And why would you say it's wrong? It's right. They destroyed my family, or, my parents got divorced because of the revolution, and whatever's happening now should be happening. And so that speaks to what you said about the difference of opinions because of the way it's impacted in different ways.
The one question we often ask that, we can kind of think through it in a different way, because I know you're not a therapist, Pardis, but therapists often miss things, and they often get things wrong, especially when they don't have the knowledge and the understanding of their client's experience. And so to me, we often say, what do therapists get wrong? But you started to say this is how therapists can help. So maybe we can go from a more positive aspect of what are the things that therapists should really be looking for, things that would be helpful. In a practical way, our survival guide for therapists, what do you want, Pardis, for therapists to know?
Yeah, I guess I would want therapists to consider this context of 40 plus years of weight that for many of us are unresolved issues. They're things that we haven't dealt with head on, and suddenly now we're being forced to do that, right? We've suppressed it in many ways. I remember hearing a therapist once say that depression is a traffic jam of sadness. And I feel like, for 40 years, for so many of us, that traffic jam has been building and building and building. And we've never tried to clear the freeways, if you will, and so I think that very long context of pain and angst, I think, is something that I would want therapists to know about, and to help us to clear that traffic jam, and to think about, okay, well, what were the impacts? It's interesting. I'm now starting to think about things that happened in the 80s that I just didn't deal with head on. So I think that's really helpful. But I think it would be really helpful for therapists to help us think through how we talk about this with our families. So I mentioned my kids, but many of us are married to non-Iranians. My husband is Chinese American. And, how do we talk about this at the dinner table, without it impacting families so much more than, they've already been impacted. My kids have already been impacted by what's going on, by the news headlines, really, and since 2016, by the narratives about Muslims and Islamophobia. They're already impacted. How do we keep the family unit strong? And how do we talk about this with our non-Iranian partners, or with our half Iranian children, or with our, Iranian American children, all of us who are hyphenated, how do we narrate the experience of the hyphen?
And to add on to that, I also think that it's okay for therapists not to know and ask, if you don't know something, ask about it, ask how it's impacting them. Don't just assume that, because you have a couple Iranian friends, or that they all feel the same way, and everyone's different. I think that's really important. And I've seen that in my own practice with my Iranian clients. They all vary in the way that they feel about everything that's going on.
I think that's a really good point, making sure that we really pay attention, stay informed, and then understand that this isn't a monolithic group of people who have one experience, because the country has changed so dramatically. Immigration timelines are very different for different folks. The connection to Iran is very different depending on a lot of different factors. And so staying knowledgeable, but also really, I like that, Negeen, really asking and seeking out that individual experience and what the things are that person is facing, which is what we should be doing as therapists anyway. But I think it can be hard when there's something that's so dramatically impactful happening in all of our lives as Americans, thinking about, quote unquote, World War III. I think we can get into that place of uncertainty and fear and not necessarily use all of the skills that we have. So I really appreciate both of you being here and helping us with this today. Pardis, one of the things we like to do is kind of link to books and all those things. So where can people find you?
Well, you can easily find me at my personal website, which is www.pardismahdavi.com. But as I said, I'm the director of the School of Social Transformation here at Arizona State University. You can find information about me at ASU or on the web or on my personal website. And I would just be really happy, for people to engage with my work.
You can find me at therapywithnegeen.com, and my Instagram handle is the same.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll include links to both Pardis and Negeen's contact in our show notes. You can find those at mtsgpodcast.com. And while you're on our website, check out all of the cool stuff that Katie and I are doing. We're going to be speaking in Hawaii here next month. We got our 3rd annual Therapy Reimagine conference coming up here in September in the Los Angeles area, and all sorts of other cool stuff that we're doing that I'm just not going to spend more of our time talking about. So check us out and on our socials. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, Pardis Mahdavi, and Negeen Moussavian.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Lisa Marie Accounting.
It's time to be empowered by your biz money. When the birth control pill came on the scene, women were empowered sexually. No longer did they have to depend on a man for protection or preparation or provision. Financial Freedom Monthly does the same for women entrepreneurs regarding their finances.
With a constant but sassy eye on budgeting, growth, income, and outgo, plus a heavy dose of mindset upleveling around finances, abundance, pricing, and growth, our members are financially empowered.
They know where their business money is going, they have a plan, and the profit to grow. They're overly dependent on no one, including that needy client, for their income and stand tall on their own 2 financial feet. When the tax man comes around, they're prepared for taxes and may be irritated, but they're not shocked, panicked, and scrambling for how to pay Uncle Sam.
And woman, this empowerment is sassy and sexy. Freedom Financial Monthly is an online membership for women entrepreneurs who are ready to grow not only their business, but their income, their sense of peace around finances, and confidence around cash.
Just for Therapy Reimagined listeners, register today using code Therapy Reimagined and get your membership at founding member pricing. For all the sassy details, visit Lisa at lisamarieaccounting.com/financial-freedom-monthly.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.